Mr. Lum, $600,000, luxury guitars, altered invoices.
I oversaw all museum operations and every expense I approved was documented.
One invoice.
Brady Lum thought he covered his tracks. What he missed was a single altered invoice, and that one document ended a 7-year career at one of Atlanta's most celebrated institutions.
Invoice for museum, it was actually a guitar and accessories.
I need to speak with my attorney before I say anything.
The questions in the foyer would not get answered. Within 90 days, federal agents with the FBI's Atlanta field office had assembled more than 200 altered invoices, 6 years of corporate credit card statements, and a private collection of 43 luxury guitars purchased with money that did not belong to him. $600,000. One museum. One man with sole approval authority over his own expenses. And one doctored invoice from November of 2024 that would unravel every last thread. Real talk. How many people in your office have the authority to approve their own expenses with no second set of eyes? Drop that number in the comments. And if you are not subscribed, hit it now. We cover stories like this every single week, and the next one is worse than this one. Brady Allen Lum was born in May of 1966 in Springfield, Illinois. The second of 3 children in a household where Sunday afternoons revolved around a hand-me-down, upright piano his mother had inherited from her grandmother. His father worked as a regional manager for a paper distributor that serviced school districts across central Illinois. His mother taught 4th grade at Isles Elementary for 27 years. There was no money for luxuries. There was money for music lessons. His mother enrolled him in classical piano at age 7 through a community music program at the Hoogland Center for the Arts. By 11, he had picked up his older brother's nylon string acoustic guitar and quietly stopped practicing piano altogether. By 15, he had saved $187 from a summer job stocking shelves at a Springfield IGA and purchased a used Fender Stratocaster copy from a pawn shop on South Grand Avenue. The instrument was, by his own admission later in life, an entry-level disappointment. But he kept it for over 40 years. He graduated from Springfield High School in 1984. His yearbook described him as quiet, focused, and a member of the jazz ensemble. He enrolled at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign that fall, initially declaring a major in music performance before quietly switching to business administration after a single semester of music theory convinced him he did not have the discipline for a performance career. He minored in art history. That decision would shape the next 4 decades of his life. After graduating in 1988, Lum took an entry-level finance position at a regional bank in Champaign, making just over $22,000 a year. He stayed for 3 years. He met his wife, a public school art teacher named Diane, at a Friday night gallery opening in 1990. They married in October of 1992 in a small ceremony at her parents' Methodist church in Decatur. Their first child, a daughter, arrived in 1995. Their son followed in 1998. Lum's career trajectory was, on paper, exactly the kind of steady, unremarkable climb that nonprofit search committees love to see. In 1993, he took an associate finance role at the Krannert Art Museum in Champaign. In 1998, he moved to the Joslin Art Museum in Omaha as assistant controller. In 2003, he was promoted to controller. In 2007, he became chief financial officer of a mid-sized regional art institution in St. Louis. Performance evaluations from this period describe him as detail-oriented, fiscally disciplined, and possessing what one supervisor called a quiet authority that made colleagues comfortable bringing him difficult problems. He never lost the guitars. By 2010, colleagues at the St. Louis Museum had begun to notice that his small office contained a single piece of personal decor that did not fit the room: a black and white photograph of a 1959 Gibson Les Paul Standard in a thin frame on his bookshelf. He never spoke about it unless asked. When asked, he would smile and say only that it was the Holy Grail. In 2014, the Lum family relocated to Atlanta when Brady accepted a deputy operating role under the Woodruff Art Center umbrella. They purchased a 4-bedroom home in the Brookhaven neighborhood for $612,000. Diane took a part-time position teaching art at a private elementary school in Sandy Springs. Their daughter enrolled at Emory University. Their son started 9th grade at North Atlanta High School. On the surface, everything was normal. On the surface, everything was earned. On January 2, 2019, after a national search and a unanimous vote of the High Museum of Art's executive leadership, Brady Lum was named Chief Operating Officer of one of the most important art institutions in the southeastern United States. The press release praised his nearly 3 decades of nonprofit financial leadership and his deep personal commitment to the arts. His starting salary was $278,000 a year, plus performance bonuses, plus a generous benefits package. He was 52 years old. He had reached, by any measure, the peak of his career. The High Museum of Art occupies a striking white Richard Meier building at 1280 Peachtree Street Northeast, anchoring the Woodruff Art Center campus in Midtown Atlanta. It houses more than 19,000 works of art across multiple wings, draws roughly 400,000 visitors a year, and operates on an annual budget of just over $38 million. Approximately 12% of that budget comes from federal sources, including grants from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and pass-through funding tied to specific exhibitions and education programs. That federal funding is the legal hinge that would later turn this case into a matter for the Federal Bureau of Investigation rather than the Atlanta Police Department. Any nonprofit institution that receives more than $10,000 in federal funds in a given year falls under the jurisdiction of a specific federal statute. Theft from such an institution becomes theft concerning programs receiving federal funds, codified at 18 U.S.C. Section 666. The penalty is up to 10 years in federal prison. The High Museum's expense approval system was, in theory, robust. Department heads submitted purchase requests and reimbursement claims through an internal procurement portal. Each request required documentation, a stated business purpose, and approval from a supervisor at the appropriate level. Small expenses under $1,000 could be approved by department directors. Mid-range expenses up to $10,000 required vice president sign-off. Anything larger climbed the ladder toward the chief operating officer, the chief financial officer, and, for the largest expenditures, the executive committee of the board. The chief operating officer sat at the top of the operational pyramid. The COO oversaw facilities, security, technology, human resources, finance, retail, and visitor services. The COO had delegated approval authority for nearly every category of operational spending up to $25,000 per transaction, and for many recurring vendor relationships, the authority extended further still. The COO approved his own corporate credit card reimbursements. The COO selected the cost centers against which expenses would be charged. The COO had access to the museum's full chart of accounts and the ability to make routine accounting adjustments without prior approval. The system relied on a single assumption. The system relied on the integrity of the person sitting in that chair. The audit committee reviewed budgets quarterly. The external auditors reviewed the books annually. Neither was structured to catch a series of small, individually plausible expenses spread across dozens of cost centers over a period of years. The auditors looked for material misstatements. They looked at categories of spending. They did not pull individual invoices to verify that the underlying transactions matched the documentation submitted in the file. In short, the museum trusted its chief operating officer to be the steward of its money. The federal grants that helped fund exhibitions for Atlanta school children, the membership dollars from local families who scraped together $100 a year to support an institution they believed in, the endowment gifts from donors who had written checks across generations. All of it flowed through systems that, ultimately, required the man at the top to act in good faith. The first altered invoice federal investigators would later identify was dated April 18, 2019. Brady Lum had been in his new role for exactly 106 days. The purchase, according to the documentation submitted to the museum's accounting department, was a $3,200 acquisition of audiovisual presentation equipment from a vendor in Marietta, Georgia. The invoice on file showed a line item labeled Professional AV Equipment, Education Programming. The cost center charged was the museum's education department budget. The expense was approved by Brady Lum in his capacity as Chief Operating Officer, 12 hours after he submitted it for reimbursement against his corporate credit card. The original invoice, recovered by investigators 6 years later from the vendor's archived records, told a different story. It was for a single Martin D28 acoustic guitar, a hardshell case, and a set of premium phosphor bronze strings. The vendor was not an audio-visual equipment supplier. The vendor was Maple Street Guitars, one of Atlanta's most respected acoustic instrument dealers. The pattern was established. The pattern would not vary in its essentials for the next 6.5 years. Step 1. Lum would purchase a guitar, a piece of recording equipment, a vintage amplifier, or, beginning in 2021, woodworking tools for the small luthier shop he was quietly building in his Brookhaven basement. He paid for these purchases on his museum-issued American Express corporate card. Step 2. He would obtain the legitimate vendor invoice. Then, using a copy of the museum's standard purchase order template and a basic PDF editing tool, he would generate a parallel invoice with the same dollar amount but a different line item description. The fake invoice always described something operationally plausible: a V cabling for a temporary exhibition, specialty mounting hardware for a gallery installation, replacement office furniture for the Security Operations Center. Step 3. He would submit the altered invoice into the procurement system, charge the expense against a cost center where similar expenses would not raise eyebrows, and approve the reimbursement using his own delegated authority. Step 4. He would file the documentation in the appropriate folder and move on with his day. The amount started small. The 2019 purchases averaged just under $4,000 apiece, and there were only 7 of them across the year. He was testing the system. He was learning where the seams were. He was watching for any sign that someone was checking his work. No one was checking his work. By 2020, the average transaction had climbed to $5,600, and the frequency had nearly doubled. The pandemic that year created additional cover. Operational spending across the museum shifted in unpredictable ways as exhibitions were postponed and remote work technology purchases spiked. Unusual line items were easier to bury in unusual times. By 2022, Lum was averaging just over $7,000 per transaction and making 1 to 2 such purchases per month. His basement collection now included a 1962 Fender Stratocaster, a 1957 Gibson Les Paul Gold Top, 3 Martin acoustics, 2 boutique handmade instruments from a luthier in North Carolina, and an array of vintage tube amplifiers that filled an entire wall. He spread the charges intelligently. Some months the expense hit the facility's cost center. Other months it landed against technology, or visitor services, or special exhibitions. He used his accounting access to occasionally reclassify expenses after the fact, moving entries between cost centers to keep any one budget line from spiking visibly. The annual audit always found the books balanced. The books were balanced. The money was simply going somewhere other than what the documentation claimed. He also added a second category to the scheme in 2021. He began submitting reimbursement claims for what the invoices described as professional development training. The legitimate underlying invoices were for private guitar lessons with a respected Atlanta jazz instructor, weekly for 2 years, at $120 per session. The altered documentation described them as continuing education seminars in nonprofit management. He approved his own reimbursements. By 2024, the woodworking equipment had been added to the mix. He had begun teaching himself to build his own acoustic guitar bodies, and the basement workshop now contained a Festool track saw, a saw-stop cabinet table saw, a precision drum sander, and a custom fabricated jig for steam-bending guitar sides. Each tool, each accessory, each shipment of tonewood ran through the same laundering machine. He was no longer testing the system. He was bleeding it. The first crack appeared on December 1st, 2025. The museum's chief financial officer, a woman who had joined the High 3 years earlier from a national accounting firm, had been quietly preparing the institution for an enhanced audit cycle ahead of a planned capital campaign. The capital campaign required a clean, granular look at the museum's last 5 years of operational spending. The CFO had asked a junior member of her finance team to pull a random sample of vendor invoices from across cost centers and to verify that each one matched both the purchase order and the underlying business purpose. The junior analyst found something strange in an invoice from October of 2023. The vendor name on the invoice did not return any search results when she ran it through standard business databases. The address listed did not appear to be a commercial address at all. She flagged the file for her supervisor. The supervisor pulled a second invoice from the same vendor, then a third. Then she ran a broader query across the procurement system, looking for vendors whose names matched the pattern of those first 3 flagged files. The query returned more than 200 entries spread across 6.5 years. Every single one of them had been approved by the same person. She brought the file to the CFO on the afternoon of December 4th. The CFO brought it to the museum's chief executive officer the next morning. The CEO brought it to the chair of the audit committee within 24 hours. By December 8th, the matter had been escalated to the executive committee of the Woodruff Arts Center governing board, and an independent forensic accounting firm had been retained to conduct an emergency review. On the morning of December 9th, 2025, Brady Lum was asked to meet with the museum's CEO and outside counsel in a conference room on the executive floor. He arrived with a coffee from the lobby cafe. He was told, calmly, that questions had arisen about a number of vendor invoices that had been approved under his authority, that an independent review was underway, and that he was being asked to take administrative leave pending the outcome. He did not ask which invoices. He did not ask which vendors. He did not ask what specifically had been flagged. He nodded once, and he asked whether he should submit a written resignation that morning or wait for further guidance. The CEO and the outside counsel exchanged a glance. The outside counsel suggested that resignation was a decision he might want to make after consulting with an attorney of his own. He resigned anyway. The letter was 3 sentences long. It was on the CEO's desk before lunch. The independent forensic review would take 10 weeks. It would identify 217 altered invoices spanning the entire duration of his tenure. The total loss to the museum, calculated to the cent, came to $603,841.12. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's Atlanta field office opened a formal case file on February 23, 2026. The forensic accountants had handed over a binder that contained every altered invoice in chronological order, cross-referenced against the original vendor records that the museum's outside counsel had subpoenaed from each of the underlying suppliers. The agents assigned to the case did not need to build a paper trail. The paper trail had been built for them. They needed to verify it, expand it, and turn it into a federal indictment. We are about to get into the smoking gun and the arrest. If you have made it this far, you already know this story is something else. Subscribe if you want to see more cases where the people we trust to be the grown-ups in the room turn out to be the worst actors of all. We do this every single week. Agents began by visiting each of the vendors who had appeared on the altered invoices. Maple Street Guitars in Atlanta, a specialty acoustic instrument dealer in Athens, a private guitar instructor whose studio was in a converted carriage house in Inman Park, a woodworking tool distributor in Marietta, a boutique luthier in Asheville, North Carolina. At each location, the vendors produced the original sales records. At each location, the original records bore no resemblance to the documentation that had been filed at the High Museum. In every case, the legitimate invoice was for a personal use item. In every case, the museum's file contained an altered document with a different description, a different vendor name occasionally, and the same dollar figure to the cent. The agents recovered text messages from Lum's personal cell phone after the execution of a search warrant on March 4, 2026. The messages told their own story. Lum to a guitar dealer in Asheville, July 18, 2023. Send the original invoice to my personal email, not the corporate one. I will handle the receipts on my end. Just make sure the bill of sale matches the wire amount. Dealer to Lum, same date. Will do. Same as last time? Lum to dealer, same as last time. Lum to his private music instructor, March 3rd, 2024. Going to start running the lesson payments through the museum card. Just keep the invoices generic if you can. Continuing education language is fine. Instructor to Lum. Got it. Anything else you need on my end? Lum. No, that covers it. There were 41 such exchanges across his personal phone, spanning more than 5 years. None of them were ambiguous. Then there was the November 2024 invoice. The agents would later describe it as the cleanest single piece of evidence in the entire file. On November 12, 2024, Lum had submitted a reimbursement claim for $9,147.87. The documentation described the purchase as digital presentation equipment for the museum's lecture hall renovation. The cost center charged was facilities improvement. The original invoice, recovered from the vendor in pristine condition, was for a 1959 Gibson Les Paul Standard reissue, a handmade hardshell case lined with red velvet, and a set of vintage-style pickups. $9,147.87. To the cent. The black and white photograph of the 1959 Gibson Les Paul Standard had hung on his office shelf for 15 years. He had told colleagues with a small smile that it was the Holy Grail. In November of 2024, with the museum's money, he had bought himself the closest reproduction he could legally acquire. One altered document. The museum's money turned into a guitar. The pettiness of the object. The grandeur of the institution that had been looted to acquire it. That single invoice would appear on the front page of the federal indictment as the representative count. Federal agents arrived at the Brookhaven home at 6:47 in the morning on April 14, 2026. There were 6 of them, 2 from the FBI's Atlanta White Collar Squad, 2 from the United States Attorney's Office, 2 uniformed officers from a neighboring jurisdiction providing support. They knocked once. Brady Lum opened the door in a pressed blue button-down shirt and gray slacks, holding a coffee mug. He had been awake for nearly an hour. He had been expecting them, in some form, for 4 months. Agent. Mr. Lum, we have a federal arrest warrant. May we step inside? Lum. Yes, of course, Agent. Sir, are you alone in the house? Lum. My wife is upstairs. She is aware of why you are here. Agent. We also have a search warrant for the premises, with particular focus on a basement workshop and any musical instruments or related equipment on the property. Lum. It is all in the basement. I will show you. The agents would later describe the conversation as one of the most cooperative initial encounters they had experienced in a white-collar case. Lum did not argue. He did not deny. He did not invoke counsel until the formal questioning began. He simply led the agents down the basement stairs and stood in the doorway of his workshop while they began the inventory. The basement contained 43 guitars, 16 vintage amplifiers, 3 custom-built handmade acoustic guitars in various stages of construction on his workbench, a complete professional-grade woodworking shop, an archive of more than 200 pages of printed receipts in a filing cabinet beside his workbench, organized by year with handwritten notes in the margins. He looked at the agents. He looked at the room he had built with money that did not belong to him. He spoke once more before the formal questioning began. Lum, I know what this is about. I want to call my attorney now. Those were the last words he spoke to the agents that morning that were not procedural. Later that day, Brady Lum was arraigned in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia. He was charged with 1 count of theft concerning programs receiving federal funds in violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 666. The charge carries a maximum penalty of 10 years in federal prison and a fine of up to $250,000, in addition to mandatory restitution. He pleaded not guilty at arraignment, a procedural posture his attorney would later describe as a placeholder while plea negotiations continued. Within 72 hours of the arraignment, his attorney informed the assigned Assistant United States Attorney that his client intended to move toward a guilty plea and full restitution. Federal sentencing guidelines for theft of this magnitude, with no prior criminal history and full acceptance of responsibility, would suggest a recommended sentence in the range of 46 to 57 months. The defense would argue for the low end. The government, in its preliminary filings, signaled that it would argue for the high end. The High Museum of Art issued a public statement on the afternoon of the arraignment. The statement was carefully worded. It expressed gratitude to the institution's finance team for identifying the irregularities. It pledged a comprehensive review of internal controls. It thanked the FBI and the United States Attorney's Office for their professionalism. It did not name Brady Lum a single time. The chair of the Woodruff Arts Center board addressed the situation more directly in a separate statement issued the following day. The trust of our donors, our members, and the public is the foundation of everything we do, the statement read. When an individual in a position of fiduciary responsibility violates that trust, the harm extends far beyond the dollars stolen. It reaches every person who ever wrote a check, paid for a membership, or brought a child through our doors believing that this institution belonged to them. It does belong to them, and we will not forget it. The 43 guitars, the 16 amplifiers, and the woodworking equipment were seized as part of the asset forfeiture process. Federal prosecutors indicated their intention to sell the entire collection at public auction, with proceeds to be applied directly to the restitution owed to the museum. Preliminary appraisals valued the seized collection at approximately $390,000, well below the $600,000 the forensic review had identified as the total loss. Diane Lum filed for divorce 18 days after her husband's arrest. The Brookhaven home went on the market in May for $625,000. The couple's 2 adult children, both now in their late 20s, declined every interview request. Brady Lum is currently scheduled for a sentencing hearing in the late summer of 2026, pending the formal entry of his guilty plea. He will be 60 years old when he reports to whichever low-security federal facility the Bureau of Prisons designates. He will be 64 or 65 when he is released. He will have spent nearly 7 years building a basement workshop with stolen money and roughly 4 years inside a federal institution thinking about it. He once told a colleague at the museum, looking at the black and white photograph of the 1959 Gibson Les Paul on his office shelf, that he had wanted that guitar since he was 11 years old. He had not been able to afford it on his own, so he had taken something that did not belong to him to acquire it. And the moment he did, the institution that had trusted him with its checkbook began the slow process of finding out. That case was something else. But the case on the right-hand side is even more shocking. Click it now.